Sometimes the biggest leaks in a game are the ones no one talks about. They do not show up in a single hand or a dramatic pot. They slip through in quiet ways. A little too much comfort in the familiar. A little too much trust in habits that feel safe. Over time, these small leaks add up, quietly draining win rates from even the most careful players. Tonight, we will look closely at the patterns that shape live 1-3 cash games. We will see why playing what feels solid is not always profitable. We will notice how river bets reveal more than they seem. We will watch how limp calling and multi-way pots change the value of aggression. We will see why top pair is not always enough, and how a repeatable process can protect against slow losses. Each idea builds on the last, showing how small choices shape long-term results. The pressure here is slow and constant. It is not about one mistake or one big moment. It is about time passing at the table. Hands blending together. Money slipping away in ways that are easy to miss. For now, let your pace ease. There is no need to hurry or prepare. The sound and rhythm will stay steady. We can settle in and let the game slow down around us. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Playing Solid. Most players sitting in a 1-3 game have a story they tell themselves. It goes something like this. They stayed patient. They folded when they should have. They did not do anything crazy. And at the end of the night, they walked out without losing their whole stack. That feels victorious. It seems disciplined. But what it actually describes is survival, and survival is not the same thing as profit. The problem starts with how most players measure themselves. They're counting the bad things they avoided, rather than the good things they extracted. No wild bluffs. No bad calls. No going broke. That list can look pretty clean, even when the session was a slow bleed. Because here's the thing about break-even, or slightly losing play at 1-3, it does not announce itself. You do not leave the casino feeling crushed. You leave feeling like you played okay. And that quiet, comfortable feeling is exactly where the problem hides. Actual winning at this level requires something different in orientation. It's not just about stopping the bleeding. It's about going out there and taking money from the table. That means finding spots where you have an edge and making sure those spots pay you fully. Defensive players, the ones focused on not messing up, tend to miss that second part. They're so focused on not losing that they forget to win. Over hundreds of hours, that gap between not losing big and consistently winning becomes very real, and it shows up in the numbers, even when it does not show up in any single session. There's also a cost most players underestimate. The rake. Whether the house is pulling a percentage from each pot or charging you by the hour, that cost is always there, always working against you. Just not losing does not cover rake. You have to actually generate profit over and above that ongoing expense before you see a single dollar of net gain. That means playing to extract value is not optional. It's the baseline requirement for staying ahead. Let me give you a hand that looks completely normal. You're on the button with King-Queen of Spades in a 9-handed game. 2 players limp in front of you. You raise to $12. Both limpers call, the blinds fold, and we go 3 ways to a flop of Queen of Diamonds, 6 of Clubs, 4 of Hearts. Pot is $40. You flop top pair with a solid kicker. You bet $15. Both players call. Turn is the 8 of Spades. You check. One player bets 40, the other folds, and you let it go. Now on the surface, That looks fine. You flopped well. You bet. It didn't work out. But look at the structure. Your pre-flop raise was too small to thin the field. Your flop bet was barely a third of the pot, which gave both opponents an easy price to continue. You created the multi-way situation, and then you paid for it. Nobody made a spectacular play against you. You just bled a little bit. And this is the kind of hand that happens 6, 8, 10 times a session. None of them feel like mistakes. All of them cost you money. Now let's talk about something that might surprise you. One of the highest leverage skills in this game may be bet sizing, rather than just hand selection, bluff frequency, or reading people. Not in some abstract way, but mathematically. The size of your bet determines how much money comes into the pot when you have the better hand. That's it. And when you get that size wrong consistently, even by a small margin, you're leaving money on the table every single time. Say you've got a strong hand, and you undersize your value bet because you're worried about scaring your opponent away. Maybe you bet a third of the pot instead of 2/3. Your opponent calls. You win the hand. Feels fine. But you won less than you should have, and that difference, repeated across thousands of hands, becomes a meaningful drag on your win rate. The hand did not feel like a mistake. You won it. But the sizing was a mistake, and those subtle errors are the toughest to spot. The other direction causes problems too. When you oversize in spots where your opponent is not strong enough to call, you're folding them off money that could have gone in your pocket. You collect the pot, but it's smaller than it needed to be. A well-chosen size would have built a bigger pot by keeping them in. Over a long run, consistently making those kinds of sizing errors, whether too small or too large, drains your win rate in ways that are nearly impossible to detect, session to session. That invisibility is why the leak persists. Players who consider themselves competent can make the same sizing error 10,000 times and never realize it because they keep winning the hands. There's one more thing worth understanding about small pots and sizing. When pots are consistently small because of undersizing, the rake can hit proportionally harder. The house takes its cut regardless, so keeping pots artificially small means you're giving up a bigger slice of each hand to the rake than you would if you sized correctly. It's a compounding problem that goes in one direction. So let's think about how a player ends up here. They sat down, they stayed calm, they folded some marginal stuff. They did not tilt when they took a bad beat. That all sounds right. And emotionally, it is right. Staying calm matters. Folding when you should matters. But here's what can happen when things go smoothly for a long time. You stop questioning your habits. You start treating your defaults as correct, simply because they have not blown up in your face. Maybe you limp in a little too often. Maybe you call in spots you should fold, or fold in spots you should call. Maybe you're not adjusting when the table changes, when the loose player leaves and a tight one sits down. None of those habits produce a dramatic losing moment. Nobody sees it. You do not feel it. The multi-way pots that are so common in Live 1 and 3 actually make this worse, because bad pre-flop decisions can get buried in the chaos of 4 people seeing a flop. You do not always get clear feedback that something went wrong. That's the real danger of feeling solid. The comfort itself becomes the obstacle. Players who feel in control often stop doing the kind of honest evaluation that would help them improve. They're measuring their play by the absence of disasters, rather than by the presence of value. And those two things pull in completely different directions, as goals. Emotional stability is genuinely valuable. You want to be the person at the table who stays level when the cards run bad. But stability and strategic accuracy are not the same thing. You can be calm and leak chips quietly. You can feel good about a session and still be a net loser over time. The two need to be developed separately, and neither one substitutes for the other. What it actually means to play well in this game is not about surviving sessions. It's about extracting the maximum amount of value available to you across a very large number of hands. That's the standard, and everything else gets measured against it. Chapter 2: The River Honesty Problem. There's a particular kind of player who sits down at a live table, plays a solid session, makes good decisions all night, and still walks away down money. They can't quite figure out what went wrong. Their big hands held up. They didn't make any obvious blunders. But somewhere in the evening, small leaks cost them quietly. Hook with a vivid scene. Picture this: the river card lands, your opponent fires a big bet, and you hesitate. Here's why folding is often the winning move. Most players at a $1, $3 game are not bluffing large on the river. That's not a guess. That's a consistent pattern across the alternate, with field, player base, or typical opponents, where context allows. The reason isn't complicated. Imagine sitting across a table from someone, looking them in the eye, and firing a big bet with nothing. Then they call. Everyone at the table sees it. You flip over your hand, and it's air. That moment, the embarrassment, the looks, the feeling of being exposed, that registers differently in a live setting than it does clicking a button online. In an online environment, you just move to the next hand. At a live table, you sit there. You feel it. And for a lot of players, avoiding that feeling is worth more than the chips they'd gain from bluffing correctly. This isn't irrational from a personal comfort standpoint, but it creates something deeply exploitable. When an entire population avoids large river bluffs to sidestep embarrassment, their big river bets carry a strong lean toward value. Not every time, but often enough to matter. People also tend to remember the times a bluff got caught, far more sharply than the times they quietly folded and gave up a pot they could have won. That imbalance in memory reinforces caution. The caught bluff feels vivid and painful. The missed value fades quickly. Over time, that selective memory pushes players even further toward honest play on the final street. So when you're facing a large river bet from a typical live opponent, a mathematically sound default is to give them credit. Fold more than feels comfortable. Not because you're afraid, but because the population data supports it. Discipline here is not weakness. It's the correct response to a real pattern. Here's how this looks in practice. You're in the cutoff with king, queen of clubs. You raise to 15, the button calls, everyone else folds. Flop comes queen of hearts, 8 of diamonds, 5 of spades. You bet 20, button calls. Turn is the 9 of clubs. You bet 55, button calls again. River is the 2 of diamonds. A total brick. You check. The button now bets 150 into a pot of 184. You look down at top pair, good kicker, and you think about it. You talk yourself into a call. Villain turns over, ace queen of diamonds. You lose. Now here's the thing. That river bet was huge. And against most live opponents in this game, a bet that size on the river almost always means exactly what it looks like. Strength. But something in your gut wanted to catch a bluff. That curiosity is expensive. You didn't lose this pot because you played the hand badly. You lost it on one decision, at the end, because you ignored what the population is telling you. Live players at this level are not making big river bluffs with any real frequency. Respect the bet, save the 150, and move on. Here's how this looks in practice. You're in the cutoff with King Queen of clubs. You raise to 15. The button calls. Everyone else folds. Flop comes Queen of hearts, 8 of diamonds, 5 of spades. You bet 20, button calls. Turn is the 9 of clubs. You bet 55, button calls again. River is the 2 of diamonds. A total brick. You check. The button now bets 150 into a pot of 184. You look down at top pair, good kicker, and you think about it. You talk yourself into a call. Villain turns over ace, queen of diamonds. You lose. Now here's the thing. That river bet was huge. And against most live opponents in this game, a bet that size on the river almost always means exactly what it looks like. Strength. But something in your gut wanted to catch a bluff. That curiosity is expensive. You didn't lose this pot because you played the hand badly. You lost it on one decision, at the end, because you ignored what the population is telling you. Live players at this level are not making big river bluffs with any real frequency. Respect the bet, save the 150, and move on. Now here's where a lot of players get this backwards. They start thinking of hero calls as a skill. There's a version of poker culture that treats catching a bluff as proof of good reads, as evidence that you're sharp and paying attention. And there's something seductive about that framing. You call a big bet, your opponent shows a bluff, and you feel like a genius. But if the population you're playing against is genuinely under-bluffing at large sizes, then that hero call isn't a winning play repeated over time. It's a losing one that happened to work out once. This is where population-based thinking becomes essential. Any single hand tells you almost nothing. Profitability only becomes visible when you repeat the same decision across many instances of the same situation. If you face a pot-sized river bet, the math is clear. You're calling 1 unit to win a total pot of 3, which means you need roughly 33% equity to break even. Against a population whose large river bets are heavily weighted toward value, your equity in that spot is often well below that threshold. The call is losing even when it occasionally works. Against a half-pot bet, you need closer to 25%, which changes the calculation, but the population imbalance still applies. The discomfort of folding a strong hand to a big river bet is real. It feels like giving up. It feels like the opponent is taking something from you. But that discomfort is often the correct read on the situation, not a sign that you're missing something. When you recognize that feeling and fold anyway, you're making a disciplined decision that earns money over time, even though it loses you this particular pot right now. The flip side of this pattern is where you actually start taking chips from the table. If live opponents are not bluffing large, that tells you something important about how they're calling. Players who play rivers honestly tend to call them honestly too. They show up on the river with 1 pair hands they can't release. They defend weak 2-pair combinations because folding feels wrong. They came to play, and they want to see what you've got. That tendency, calling too widely with mediocre holdings, is exactly the opening that thin value betting exploits. Thin value betting means you're betting hands that aren't the nuts, hands that aren't dominant, but hands that are expected to win more often than they lose against the range your opponent is likely to call with. You don't need to have the best possible hand. You need to have a hand that beats the hands your opponent is likely to hold when they call. Against a population that defends with 1 pair hands and reluctantly lets go of weak-made hands, You can bet thinner than you might expect. Sizing matters here in a specific way. A smaller river bet generates more calls from weaker holdings. When you scale down the size, you make it easier for your opponent to convince themselves the call is worth it, and that works in your favor when you're betting for value. You're not trying to get called by strong hands. You're trying to get called by the wide, mediocre range that your opponent is inclined to show up with. Smaller sizes accomplish that more reliably. What you're looking at here is two adjustments that come from the same root. The population plays rivers honestly. That honesty means their big bets are mostly value, so you fold more. And it means their calls are wide and marginal, so you bet thinner for value. Neither adjustment requires elaborate reads or complex analysis. They both just require accepting what the population consistently shows you and responding accordingly. The instinct to call and find out, to protect your ego, to prove you can spot a bluff, that instinct is costing you money quietly. The instinct to bet small with a decent hand and collect from a wide calling range, that one is adding to your stack a little at a time. Both movements are slow. Both are invisible in any one session. But across many sessions, they add up to the difference between a player who wonders why they keep losing and one who knows exactly where the money comes from. Chapter 3: The Limp-Call Economy. Passivity shows up long before the river. The calling down tendencies you'll see on 5th Street are really just the tail end of something that starts the moment players post their blinds and look at their cards. That same reluctance to take aggressive action, to build pots with intention, to commit chips with confidence, it all begins pre-flop. And in most $1-3 games, it shows up in one very specific behavior: limping. When someone limps in a $1-3 game, you shouldn't immediately assume they're slow playing aces. That happens, but it's far less common than most players at the table suspect. The more accurate read is that they're holding something they're unsure about. Maybe it's a suited connector they want to see, a cheap flop with. Maybe it's a middle pocket pair they don't quite trust. Maybe it's two face cards that feel strong enough to play, but not strong enough to build a pot with. What ties all of these holdings together is uncertainty. The limp is a way of staying in the hand without making a real statement. Now think about what happens when that same player limps and then calls your raise. That action, the limp call, is actually one of the most informative sequences in the game. It's telling you several things at once. First, the hand wasn't strong enough to re-raise, which removes most of the premium holdings from consideration. Second, it wasn't weak enough to fold, which removes the pure trash. What you're left with is a range that lives in the middle. Suited hands with some coordination, small to medium pocket pairs, offsuit broadways that didn't feel raise-worthy. These hands share something important. They want to realize equity cheaply. They're hoping to flop well, and then play straightforward poker from there. That range is also capped. When someone limp calls, they're communicating that they don't have a hand worth building a large pot with before the flop. And that cap matters enormously when you're deciding how to play the rest of the hand. You know roughly where their ceiling is. You don't have to worry about the very top of the range showing up very often, because those hands typically raise or re-raise. The limp call removes that threat and leaves you navigating against a range that's readable, bounded, and often speculative in nature. Knowing that is the beginning of exploiting it correctly. Watch how this plays out. You're on the button with ace-queen of hearts. 4 players limp in front of you. You raise to $12. Every single one of them calls. 5 ways to a flop of king of diamonds, 7 of clubs, 3 of spades. It checks around to you, and you bet 25 into 64. Two players call. You've now built a pot with a hand that missed, against multiple opponents who liked what they saw. You shut down, and eventually lose. Now rewind. 4 limpers in front of you, and you raise to $12. That's 4 big blinds. Into a pot that already had $16 of dead money. Of course they're all calling. You gave them a group discount to see a flop. If you make it 25 or 30 here, you're going to lose at least 2 of those callers, maybe 3. Maybe you take it down right there. That's the whole point. At this level, limpers are telling you they have a hand they like but don't love. They'll pay a small price. They won't pay a big one. Your raise size is the simplest lever you have. Use it. Here's where a lot of developing players go wrong, though. They recognize the limp, they decide to isolate, and then they raise too small. 2 times the big blind. 3 times. Sometimes even less. And the problem isn't the decision to raise. The problem is that the raise doesn't accomplish what it's supposed to accomplish. The goal of an isolation raise is to reduce the number of players you're facing. That's it. If the raise doesn't do that, it's failing at its primary function, regardless of how it's dressed up strategically. The $3 population is largely inelastic to small raises. What that means is that players who've already put a few chips in are often perfectly willing to call a small additional amount without much thought. They're anchored to their limp. They figure they're already in, so a little more doesn't feel like a big decision. So when you raise to 3 times the big blind into a pot with 3 limpers, you haven't thinned the field. You've just made the pot bigger, while keeping everyone in. Now you're playing a multi-way pot, with a larger starting stack in the middle, and you've given every speculative hand around the table better odds to continue and realize their equity. Consider softening too. Multi-way pots are generally considered harder to play than heads-up pots, or most experienced players find multi-way pots harder to navigate than heads-up pots. The equity advantage that a strong hand holds over one opponent gets diluted when there are 3 or 4 players still in. Consider verifying this statistic with a source, or adding a qualifier like approximately, or studies suggest, to acknowledge this is an empirical claim. And with multiple opponents still drawing, those pairs don't hold up as reliably. Pocket pairs flop, are set about 12% of the time, which is roughly once every 8 attempts. In a heads-up pot, those near misses are manageable. In a multi-way pot, they become expensive problems. So the fix is actually mechanical and straightforward. You need to size your isolation raise based on how many limpers are already in the pot, not based on some fixed multiple of the big blind. A common starting framework is to add 1 big blind to your raise for each limper already in. If you're in a $3 game and there are 3 limpers ahead of you, a raise to $15 or $18 is doing real work. It's putting enough pressure on the speculative hands that many of them won't feel comfortable continuing. The hands that do call are narrowing their range in a useful way, and the pot you're building is one you can navigate with clarity. There are roughly 1,326 distinct starting hand combinations in Texas Hold'em. Only 6 of those combinations exist for any specific pocket pair. There are 12 combinations of any specific unpaired offsuit hand. Around 14% of starting hands qualify as Broadway hands, meaning cards 10 through ace. What this tells you is that the hands most players are limping with, the suited connectors, the small pairs, the offsuit faces, they're not rare. They're everywhere in a $3 game. And when you size correctly, you're not hoping to always win the pot preflop. You're hoping to occasionally pick it up right there, and when you don't, to play the hand with far more clarity against one opponent who's told you quite a bit about what they're holding. Consider preflop aggression isn't primarily a personality type, or while some aggressive players may raise frequently, effective preflop aggression isn't fundamentally about personality. It's a mechanical adjustment that controls how many players you face and how much information those players give away by continuing. When you size correctly against limpers, you're not gambling. You're engineering the conditions under which your post-flop decisions become easier, more profitable, and far less dependent on running well. Chapter 4. Multiway bluffing is burning money. There's a version of poker that feels right, but quietly costs you money every session. It doesn't look like a mistake. It looks like aggression. It looks like you're taking control of the pot. But when multiple players are still in the hand and you fire that bet with nothing, you're not being aggressive. You're just paying several people to beat you. Let's slow down and look at why that happens, and what you can do instead. When you're in a pot with just one opponent, fold equity is real and manageable. You need that one person to fold. But every time you add another opponent to the pot, something important changes. It's not that your fold equity gets cut in half. It's that each player independently has to fold for your bluff to work. All of them. At the same time, think about what that means mathematically. If you're betting into two players and you estimate the first one folds roughly 70% of the time and the second one folds roughly 40% of the time, you multiply those together. 70% times 40% gives you somewhere around 28%. That's your real chance of taking the pot down right there. Not 70. Not even 50. 28. And that's under generous assumptions. Let's walk through a hand. You're in middle position with ace-king of diamonds. You raise to 15, and 3 players call. 4 ways to a flop of 8 of clubs, 6 of hearts, 2 of spades. It checks to you. You look down at your ace-king and think, I should bet. So you fire 40 into 64. 2 players call. Turn is the jack of clubs. You check. 1 player bets 75, and you fold. Now let's be honest about what happened. You bet $40 into 3 opponents on a board that connects with none of your cards. You have no pair, no draw, and no realistic story to tell. What were you hoping for? That all 3 of them would fold to a half-pot bet on a dry board. Maybe one folds. Maybe. But you need all 3 to give up, and that almost never happens at this level. The math is simple. If each player folds 60% of the time individually, which is generous, the probability all 3 fold is only about 22%. You're lighting money on fire almost 4 out of 5 times. Multiway pots demand a different gear. If you don't have a real hand or a real draw, check and let it go. Patience isn't weakness. It's the thing keeping your stack intact. Now stretch that out further. Say you've got 4 players in the pot, and each of them folds around 80% of the time to your flop bet. That sounds like an easy spot, right? Everyone's probably folding. Except when you multiply 80% 4 times over, you land at roughly 41%. Even with a wildly optimistic folding rate across all 4 opponents, you're still failing more than half the time. In reality, those individual fold rates are usually much lower, which makes the math considerably worse. And here's the part that's specific to the $1, $3 games most people are actually sitting in. The players at those tables aren't folding pairs. They're not folding draws. A lot of them aren't even folding weak top pair to a single bet. Their ranges going into the flop are wide, and their willingness to let go of a hand is limited. That combination, wide ranges with low fold rates, is exactly the environment where bluffing multiway doesn't just underperform. It quietly bleeds your stack over volume. Now, understanding the math is one thing. But the reason players keep making this mistake isn't because they don't know the math. It's because something in the moment makes the bet feel right. There's a big pot sitting in the middle. Several people limped in. The flop came out, and nobody did anything obvious. And something in you says, this is the moment. Take it now. That feeling is real. It's also a leak trigger. What's happening is you're looking at the size of the pot and reading it as an opportunity, when what you should be reading is the number of people you'd have to move off that pot simultaneously. A big pot doesn't mean there's more fold equity available. It means there are more people who helped build it and who have reasons to stick around and protect their investment. The live environment makes this worse. When you're sitting at a physical table, there's something about the momentum of the hand, the silence after the flop, the way you can see people checking their cards, that creates a sensation of power. You feel like a well-timed bet is going to scatter them. Table image creeps into your thinking. You tell yourself they respect your raises. But that instinct is bypassing the structural reality of the situation, which is that you'd need several independent people to all make the same decision in your favor. That doesn't happen on feeling. It happens on math. When you catch yourself wanting to take a shot in a multi-way pot with a weak holding, that urge itself is the signal to pause. Not to fire. To pause. So what do you do instead? You check. You fold. And you do it without feeling like you gave something up. That's the reframe that separates players who break even from players who actually win in these games over time. Checking back in a multi-way pot with a marginal hand isn't weakness. It's aggression control. It's you deciding that this particular situation doesn't meet the threshold for committing chips, and that discipline is worth something real. When you check back instead of bluffing, you're preserving your stack for spots where the math actually works for you. Heads-up pots. Two-way pots where a single opponent is more likely to be on a narrow range and more likely to fold to pressure. Those are the spots where your aggression pays. Redirecting your bluffing frequency toward those situations over the course of a session means your chips are going into higher equity spots and staying out of losing ones. There's also a structural benefit that's easy to miss. When you check back multi-way with a hand that has some marginal value, you're often protecting that hand. You're not building a pot you can't win. You're keeping the pot small enough that your marginal holding might still have enough showdown value to matter. That's pot control, and in a game full of players who won't fold to one bet, pot control is a real edge. The deeper skill here isn't knowing when to bet. It's knowing when not to. Anyone can fire a continuation bet. It takes a specific kind of discipline to look at a four-way flop, feel the pull to attack, and decide that you're going to wait for a better spot. That choice, made consistently over hundreds of hands, drives your win rate higher by month's end. Patience here means rejecting low-equity bluffs in structurally unfavorable spots. And every time you make that disciplined decision instead of the emotional one, you're compounding something positive. You're not just saving those chips. You're building the habit of deploying aggression where it actually has teeth. Chapter 5. Top pair is overvalued at this level. There's a moment at the table that almost every live player knows. You look down at something like king-queen, you raise preflop, and the flop comes king-high. You've connected. After all those hands of missing, of folding ace high to a bet, of watching other people win pots, this one feels like yours. That feeling is real. It's also among the costliest feelings in live poker. Top pair creates a kind of anchor in the mind. The moment you pair that top card, your brain logs it as an achievement. You went from king high to a made hand, and that upgrade feels significant. The problem is that your brain tends to stop evaluating right there. It treats the pairing as a destination, instead of just one data point in an ongoing read of the situation. So even when an opponent starts telling you through their bets and raises that something better is out there, the memory of that flop connection pulls you back. You don't want to let go of what felt like a win. This isn't a character flaw. It's a predictable pattern that shows up consistently, vary within 1/3 games among these players, or omit where context is clear. The hand felt like almost nothing before the flop, and now it feels like something, so the instinct is to protect it and play it through. But the feeling of strength isn't the same as actual strength. Top pair with a weak kicker, on a connected board, against a player who's been calling loose preflop and suddenly woke up with aggression, is often in serious trouble. The hand you're holding doesn't change. The evidence around it does. And that evidence is what has to drive your decisions. Now, when top pair genuinely is ahead, the most common mistake at this level runs in the opposite direction. Players check it. They slow play it out of fear that a bet will chase people away, or they try to look tricky, or they're worried about getting raised. What that typically produces is a smaller pot, and opponents who get to see free or cheap cards with their draws and weaker pairs. At 1 and 3, that's a significant leak. The calling ranges here tend to be wide and inelastic, which means that a lot of opponents will call a correctly sized bet with hands you're beating. They're not folding second pair to a pot-sized bet. They're calling it with worse, and that's the entire point. Here's the flip side. You're in a 7-handed game with ace-king offsuit. You raise to 15, one player calls. Flop is king of diamonds, 8 of clubs, 5 of hearts. You bet 25, villain calls. Turn is the 4 of spades. You bet 65, villain calls again. River is the 2 of hearts. Board is bone dry. You now bet 150 into 214. Villain thinks for a while and calls with king 9. You win a big pot. Now, a lot of players in your seat would have bet smaller on that river. Maybe $80 or $90. They're worried about scaring the opponent off. But think about who calls you on the flop and the turn on this board. A player with a king. And at this level, a player with a king is not folding the river on a 2. They've committed too much. They're too curious. They've convinced themselves their kicker might be good. That emotional attachment to top pair is their leak, and your job is to size your bets to extract the maximum from it. Don't be polite with your value bets. The population is paying you off. Let them. When you've got top pair top kicker on a dry board, and a player who's already shown they like to call, you want to be building the pot deliberately. Betting based on what they're likely to call with, not based on what makes you feel safe. If the board is rainbow and low, and your opponent has been calling everything, a bet somewhere around 2/3 of the pot or more on the flop and turn is not reckless. It's how top pair converts into actual value. You're pricing in the weaker hands they won't let go of. That confidence at the right moment is what separates breaking even from winning over time. The real challenge is discerning when to halt that confidence. And there are patterns that make it clearer, if you're paying attention to what opponents are actually doing rather than what you want them to be doing. Check raises on the flop are one of the loudest signals you'll see at this level. Live 1-3 players, as a population, do not check raise as a bluff with any meaningful frequency. When a player who called your pre-flop raise checked to you, and then raised after your continuation bet, they are telling you something. The range of hands that takes that line at this level is heavily weighted toward 2-pair sets and strong top pair combinations with better kickers. Top pair with a medium kicker is frequently in bad shape there, and calling off more chips trying to find a spot where they're bluffing is usually a mistake. Large donk bets carry a similar message. When you've been the pre-flop aggressor and the big blind leads into you for a significant amount on the flop, that's not a typical bluffing line at this level. It's often a player who flopped something real and wants to charge you. The board texture matters here too. On a board where low and middle cards connect easily, with the ranges that called from the blinds and later positions, your top pair is frequently in a worse position than it looks, because those cards hit calling ranges hard. Sets are dealt roughly once every 8.5 pocket pair flops. On average, they're not rare. They happen, and they happen most frequently to opponents who are quietly calling your raise with small pairs and saw a flop. Multi-street aggression that doesn't slow down is the third pattern worth understanding. At this level, most players who are bluffing give up somewhere. The bet on the flop that gets called, and then a check on the turn, or a small bet that shrinks as the hand goes on. When an opponent is building pressure across the flop, the turn, and into the river without hesitation, and the board isn't particularly scary for them to be representing, that sustained commitment is typically real hand strength. A blank turn doesn't stop a player who has 2-pair or a set. It just gives them another street to keep building the pot. Folding in these spots isn't weakness. It's the correct response to the evidence on the table. And the evidence is what matters, not the memory of how good your hand felt when you paired the board. Top pair deserves respect when it's ahead, and deserves release when the signs point clearly somewhere else. It's not a hand you can evaluate once on the flop, and then cruise with through all 3 streets. Every bet, every raise, every action your opponent takes is new information. The players at this level who win consistently are the ones who keep asking the question on every street, rather than the ones who answered it once and stopped listening. Chapter 6: Building a Repeatable Exploit Framework. Imagine turning vague table reads into consistent profits. That's the power of a repeatable exploit framework. You've already spotted hands that feel strong but cost you chips. Now build a system to exploit them every session. But recognizing the problem is only the beginning. What you actually need is a system that works hand after hand, session after session, without falling apart every time the cards run cold or someone at the table gets under your skin. Much of what goes wrong at the 1-3 level isn't mysterious. It's structural. It's behavioral. The losses that pile up over time usually trace back to the same few patterns, and those patterns have less to do with not knowing enough theory and more to do with how players manage themselves at the table. That's what this framework is about. 3 connected habits that, when you practice them together, give you a real edge over the field. The first one is observation. And I want to be clear that this isn't passive. Sitting there waiting for a hand isn't the same thing as actively watching what's happening around you. A lot of players show up to a session with a fixed plan and never adjust it, no matter what the table is showing them. They play the same way against a station as they do against a nit, and then they wonder why their adjustments never seem to work. The reason is that they skipped the step that makes adjustments possible in the first place. What you're looking for doesn't require anything complicated. You're watching bet sizing patterns. You're noticing how often someone goes to showdown, and what they show when they get there. You're paying attention to how players react emotionally after losing a pot or getting raised off a hand. These things tell you a lot. At a full 9-handed table, players are typically not involved in 70 to 80% of hands, as most fold preflop most of the time and only one wins each pot. That's not dead time. That's your observation window. Let me give you one more hand to bring this all together. You've been at the table for about 2 hours. You've been watching. One player in particular has gone to showdown on the river 4 separate times, and every single time he had it. Strong hands. No bluffs. Not once. Now a new pot develops. You're involved. The board runs out dry. And this same player fires a pot-sized bet on the river. You look down at second pair. And here's the moment. Part of you wants to call. Part of you thinks maybe this time is different. But you've done the work. You've watched. You've counted. This player does not bluff rivers. So you fold. Calmly. Confidently. And later, you see him table a set. This is the framework in action. You observed a tendency. You trusted it over emotion. You protected your stack without drama. No heroics. No ego. Just a quiet, correct fold that saved you $100 or more. Do that 10 times a session, and you've added a meaningful edge to your win rate that most players at this level will never find. Even a short stretch of focused watching can give you enough to work with for the rest of the session. You don't need 100 hands on someone to know they overbet when they're tilted, or that they only raise preflop with hands they're willing to go to war with. Those tendencies show up early if you're paying attention. The players who skip this step and immediately start making adjustments based on gut feelings are leaking before they've even started. Now, once you've spotted something real, something you've actually seen the table show you, the next step is adjustment. And this is where a lot of people make a subtle but costly mistake. They see a tendency, and they try to fix everything at once. They adjust their bet sizing, their calling range, their aggression level, and their post-flop lines all at the same time. And then they can't tell what's working, because they changed too much. The better move is to isolate one lever. Pick one thing. Maybe you've noticed that a specific player folds too often when they face a bet on the turn. The adjustment is straightforward. Increase your betting frequency against that player in those specific spots. You test it, you watch the results, and you stay patient. You don't also start 3-betting them light pre-flop and floating them on the flop at the same time. Test one variable at a time. Small adjustments like this add up across a session in ways that feel subtle but matter at the end of the night. A typical tight aggressive player voluntarily puts about 15 to 20% of starting hands into the pot, and even within that range there's a lot of room to exploit patterns if you've taken the time to find them. The discipline of testing one thing at a time is what lets you actually evaluate whether your read was correct and your adjustment was sound. Without that discipline, you're just guessing in a different direction than you were before. That brings us to the third piece, and honestly, it's the one that undoes most players who manage to get the first two right. Ego. Pride. The quiet voice that tells you to keep playing a hand because folding feels like losing, or that you need to force action because you made a read and you want to prove it. These impulses feel like poker instincts, but they're not. They're emotional static, and they systematically corrode the work you've done observing and adjusting. It shows up in specific ways. You've spotted a clear spot where the framework says fold, but the pot is big and the hand feels too good to let go, so you call anyway. Or you've made a read that someone is bluffing, And instead of waiting for the right moment, you push the situation before the conditions are right, because you need to be correct right now. Both of those decisions are ego decisions. And both of them chip away at the system you've been building. Expected value, the average result of a decision repeated over many repetitions, doesn't care how a single session feels. A framework that's sound will produce negative results sometimes. That's variance, and it's normal. Trusting the process when you're running below expectation is exactly when it counts the most, because that's the moment when most players abandon their system and start playing off emotion. The players who win consistently at this level often aren't the ones with the most theoretical knowledge. They're the ones who deviate the least from their process when things get uncomfortable. That's not a personality type. It's a practiced skill. You protect the framework the same way you'd protect any asset, deliberately, consistently, and with full awareness of what threatens it. Carry the 3 steps into every session. Watch first. Adjust one thing at a time. And when ego shows up, which it will, recognize it for what it is and set it aside. The framework doesn't ask you to be perfect. It asks you to be methodical.